Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J. The new year is upon us, so to kick off the new year on a good note, this video is going to serve as a way to look back on the feedback that I received over the last year, as well as give a quick update as to where I am when it comes to the channel and what to expect/hope for in the near future. And honestly, it's been interesting to look back on the comments I've received, as it's been a useful indicator of what people are watching to the end, or at least what's motivating people to speak up. First off, before we get into the serious stuff, thanks for all the positive comments over the last year, as it means a lot to know that what I had to say meant something positive for someone else. As for the critical feedback, most of it is clustered around my reviews of Icewind Dale and Shining Force 2, so let's start with the Shining Force 2 video. First off, let's respond to an easy one, because apparently people think my pronunciation of buoy is a little off. To address that, I grew up in Central Texas, and every time I heard the word buoy, that was how it was pronounced. And even in cases like David Bowie, where people are used to hearing it spoken like that, old habits die hard. Hell, I remember this coming up at work and one of my coworkers found this heat map of how people pronounce it. Honestly, when I made the review, it didn't even cross my mind that other people pronounce it differently. So here's to another year of comments from people who inevitably don't find this video before commenting. Or I could leave a comment giving this answer, but that makes way too much sense for someone like me to actually plan ahead for. Regardless, let's get to the next point, where people were annoyed at me for some of my in-game choices, specifically with respect to who I promoted and to what class. I've tried and failed to word this response in a way that doesn't come across as condescending, so I'll stick to being blunt. For any game I play for Through the Looking Glass, I am approaching it as a newcomer playing it for the first time, and what you are watching is my direct gameplay of that first or second playthrough. If I don't know every little intricacy or bit of min-maxing, it's because I want to play the game without being a slave to guides and wiki pages. That will mean I'll inevitably make decisions that you don't like, and if you tell me in a less than friendly way about your disagreements, I'm gonna go out of my way to go against that advice. With that said, let's move on before I get even more people mad at me. Next on the chopping block, there were some commenters who found it odd that I made multiple mentions of Diablo in the review. For people new to the channel, Diablo 1 was, for a long time, the golden standard that I compared every other game to. And even now, I still hold it in high regard due to its excellent atmosphere and solid core concept. In the case of this review, it came up 3 times. One of these was in reference to grinding in an RPG, where I said that I can tolerate grinding in some circumstances, given my love of Diablo-style games. In this case, the reference is to connect my opinion with my experience, and is usually accompanied by an explanation of what I feel is necessary for me to be okay with the grinding section. Given that it was the third and final time I referenced Diablo in some capacity, I can understand the annoyance, but I think it's fair to reference relevant experience when talking about a gameplay component. Second, there was a reference made in the preamble where I said that Diablo cemented itself as a golden standard for me, but before I had played it, Shining Force 1 was a precursor to that. Since not everyone does preambles for their reviews, I may as well say generally why I add them. My goal when I'm reviewing something is to be as objective as possible, but due to the fact that I'm human, I think it's important that I make it clear what my perspective and biases are going into a game. In this case, the focus was on saying how I was initially excited due to my history with Shining Force 1, but then expressing my hesitation after realizing how basic said game was. The direct reference to Diablo probably wasn't necessary, as the same point could have been expressed by simply talking about my history with the game, but I don't think it was out of place either, and not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. The third reference, however, is where these comments do have a point, as I made a direct comparison between Shining Force 2's soundtrack and the soundtracks of both Diablo and Undertale. The Undertale comparison seemed to slip under the radar because, tonally speaking, it starts off very similar in style to Shining Force 2's soundtrack, and it's also the only time that I mentioned the game. With the other references to Diablo, however, this is where I think the ire really took hold. So to explain myself, whenever I'm judging a game's soundtrack, my focus is on how effectively it can set the tone and atmosphere of the game it's featured in, as well as its ability to stand on its own without context. In this case, the reason for the comparison was to say that the Shining Force 2 soundtrack isn't quite up to the same level as Diablo or Undertale, at least when it comes to those metrics, but it can certainly hold its own, and does a good job within its respective game. However, in hindsight, I recognize that this is a reference that you'll only understand if you know my background, and given that I phrased it in a way where it looks like a direct comparison, that's on me. I can justify the other 2 references, but that one was a bridge too far. And when you have 3 of them in a 20-minute video focused on a different game, yeah, it was too much. Next time I find this line of reasoning to be relevant, I'll just focus on the substance of how I'm judging the soundtrack, rather than making an esoteric reference to another one. Next, there was a comment asking for my thoughts on the first Shining Force game, given that I made a comment about the game not aging well during the preamble. For context, here's what I said. I went into the original Shining Force hoping to fall in love with it again, but looking at it now, it doesn't hold up as well as I expected. Perhaps it's because I have played better games since, but it was easy to notice the technical limitations of the day without even going into how, well, basic everything was. And listening back on it, I'm not sure how much I can really add without repeating myself. I liked it as a child because it was the first time I had ever encountered a game like that, but because Shining Force 1 was one of the earlier SRPGs, the limitations were also more readily apparent. To pick out an example, the second battle has you spend a decent amount of time just moving all of your units within range to take on your opponent, when you could have easily started the fight a little closer and saved us a few minutes. In a more general case, since the movement and actions were bound to the highlighted square's position, a decent amount of time is wasted as the cursor flies all over the place to look at the next unit's turn, meaning there's a lot of built-in downtime that leads the pacing to slow down to a crawl. In the case of Shining Force 2, the improved pacing meant it wasn't as much of an issue, but there are a number of small issues like that which, when combined, really drag the original down when I was replaying it. So whether that's the answer you might have wanted or not, that's why I didn't particularly enjoy Shining Force 1 when I replayed it. And finally, to cap things off, there was a very thoughtful comment which I'm going to read out verbatim. My focus is usually on paraphrasing so that I can express an understanding of what's being said, but as before, this one is very well thought out and cordial, so I'll make an exception. I agree on many things, but I think there are many aspects of this game that you missed. To name a few, the game rewards patience by making the slower leveling characters better in the long run than the faster leveling ones. Using strategy and choosing moves carefully allows you to gain more levels per battle and grind less or not at all, punishing players who just charge into battle without thinking ahead, again rewarding patience. I'll admit that I was largely unaware of a tangible difference between how quickly a character can be leveled up, though given how experience is doled out, that does make sense. I think I adequately addressed my perspective on this in the review, however, as while I can see that as being an interesting strategic outlet, I don't think there was enough information presented on the screen to encourage that kind of play. Typically when I review something, I'm looking for what might be the intended option as well as any alternatives. And since I was able to get through the game without careful strategy, at least not until the third act, and because I tend to be a lazy bastard, I will generally look for the simpler approach rather than the complex one. It just so happened in this case that the easy route was one with more grinding than otherwise. And then there's the role-playing aspect that you barely touch on. I think that Bowie gets a lot of characterization. How? Well, he is the leader of the Force. He chooses who goes to battle and who stays at headquarters, and how the Force fights. Is he an insecure leader who needs his childhood friends fighting alongside him even though they aren't good fighters? Or is he a cold-hearted man who ditches his friends for mercenaries who don't care about the cause? Is he a bloodthirsty fighter who wants to get the killing blow on enemy generals? Is he a coward who stays in the back and doesn't have the balls to get close to strong enemies? Does he frequently get outsmarted in battle? You may think I'm overanalyzing, but I think this is what role-playing is about. Now this is the part that I really wanted to discuss, because this is a fascinating idea. In some respect, there can be a bit of that whenever we're playing a game, and how we behave during combat could be interesting if it reflected on the larger world. Undertale does that to some extent, as do other games based on how bloodthirsty you are, so it's a really fascinating idea that could have a lot of nuance behind it. The problem is that when it comes to this game in particular, you get out what you put in, as none of those variations are reflected in the game itself. Because of that, you can theoretically get enjoyment out of anything through a similar process, and while that's great for a given individual, your mileage will vary. Typically when I'm making a review, my focus is definitely on how I felt, but normally for me to think something is worth sharing, I have to be able to pin it down on something that objectively happens within the game itself. And since theory crafting like this happens outside of the game world, it's hard for me to justify including something like that. Still, it does give me plenty of ideas for an SRPG where your characters grow resentful of you if you neglect them or routinely use them as the sacrificial lamb. I should add that as a game idea for when I have time to tinker with the Unity engine or something. Besides that, at least we can both agree on one thing: the ending sucks. I like how they defeated the big bad and all of the fun that entailed, but why would you have Bowie go for someone with zero characterization? Hell, there was another comment somewhere that almost exclusively tackled that, and in case the review didn't make it obvious, I am in complete agreement with that. The ending sucked. With that said, that's everything brought up for my Shining Force 2 review, so let's cover what was said in my Icewind Dale video. Before I start though, I'll admit that I'm kind of surprised by the reaction. Given that I ended up not recommending the game by the end of it, I was expecting there to be a lot more negativity if it got attention. And despite it getting more attention than most of my reviews, the comments have been surprisingly cordial. So before we get into specifics, thanks for not yelling at me over it. With that out of the way, one comment held a complete opposite opinion to me, seeing Icewind Dale as the best of what I think he means the Infinity Engine games. He describes them as BioWare D&D isometric games, but given that BioWare only developed the engine and directly made Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, with Blackout creating Planescape Torment and Icewind Dale, I'm going to assume he means the Infinity Engine games. Either way, his focus seems more on the gameplay side, as since he had complete control over his party and was creating each character, there was never an issue of picking someone due to min-maxing rather than due to loyalty or history. And in that sense, I can definitely understand the perspective. Though I gave Planescape Torment grief about there not being all that many party members, that can be seen as a problem with Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, where you're picking characters for their usefulness during gameplay rather than because of their personality. For me though, min-maxing is almost never a priority for me when I'm playing a CRPG, as the main reason I approach pretty much any CRPG is for the story first and foremost. In that sense, there's less geared towards me personally, but in case I didn't make it clear in the review, I do see the merit in being able to create your entire party. I just didn't prefer it because I tend to focus more on the story. Besides that, I also agree with this comment that there are very few times that you have to grind, which is something that I didn't really cover in my review as I went through the game without doing any grinding at all. Or rather, I didn't do anything more than clearing out every monster from the areas I found myself at, and didn't actively seek out opponents by resting in hostile areas. Regardless, however, my point about it taking too long to get through all of that still stands, as again, the mechanics should be in service to the game and not the other way around. And I would have been annoyed at the more generic encounters regardless of if they occurred from cleaning house or resting over and over. Moving on to the next comment, I was correct in saying that the game didn't have a tutorial as it relies on a manual instead. Given that my family's old copy of Baldur's Gate 2 has an exhaustive manual, I don't think I even need to worry about looking into what it says, as it's probably really informative about how everything works and did come with my GOG copy. Again though, I think my point still stands because while a manual can be a good reference guide, it doesn't necessarily act as a good substitute for an actual tutorial. I'll admit that could be my own bias talking, as I tend to learn by doing rather than by reading, but either way, if you've never played a CRPG before, take a look at Planescape Torment first. I may ruin this game for you by showing you how amazing the writing in an RPG can be, but at least the RPG mechanics themselves will be easier to figure out after seeing them firsthand. Next up, we have a commenter who wrote that he likes the game because of the atmosphere. And in this regard, I can see the appeal, as it was something that I did touch on a little bit but didn't directly address. I mentioned that the art and music are in good shape. I might have made mention about the audio design as a whole, but what I do know for certain is that I definitely didn't tie these together in talking about the atmosphere as a whole. And when you combine them, it does give a nice presentation that is pleasant to look at. The only complaint I have about the atmosphere is that the music never seemed to loop, meaning for places where I wasn't reloading the game, some areas felt strangely empty at times. Apart from that, I'm glad to hear that others enjoyed it, so moving on to the next one, which asked why I didn't review the Enhanced Edition. As I said in the review, it probably would have been wise to do so, as by my understanding, the only improvements made to Icewind Dale specifically were technical improvements. To answer the question directly, there were two reasons. First off, I'm hesitant to do business with any company that reduces consumer choice, as Beamdog did when they locked the original version behind their Enhanced Edition. It might not be a big deal in the grand scheme of things, but if someone just wanted the original warts and all, now they can't get it without spending a premium on an Enhanced Edition they're not interested in. Second, and more importantly, the focus of Through the Looking Glass is strictly on the most complete version of the original as I can find. I'm willing to cross some lines when it comes to making a game work or improving the video quality, but generally speaking, I don't want to look at what a game is like after a development team got a second crack at it. I want to see what it was like when it was first released. For instance, if the StarCraft remaster had been out when I was reviewing that game, I would have still played the original version. And finally, we have a comment which stated that I might have approached Icewind Dale with the wrong mindset. Instead of thinking about it like a CRPG in connection with Baldur's Gate, I would have been better off thinking it as the CRPG version of Diablo 2, complete with great atmosphere, plenty of character customization, and with a focus on combat rather than story. And overall, it's a really interesting point. Even as I've been responding to other comments, the majority of my time has been spent repeating the fact that I go to CRPGs for the story aspect, and was therefore likely more critical of said story than I would have otherwise. When thinking about it, that would have changed the focus for where my attention was for the story, as instead of complaining about the generic writing, I might have instead spent more time praising the game for catching me by surprise. Though I think the pacing wasn't that great in terms of gameplay or story, I could at least appreciate that. And given that I would be more positive towards it, I might have given more consideration to the atmosphere as well. However, I think I would have likely come to a similar conclusion. Though the generic writing was one of my main complaints, the fact that there was so much combat that I didn't find engaging in between the cool encounters and story moments would still be a major issue, and would have led me to be hesitant to recommend the game. My highly arbitrary ranking system might have bumped it up to a maybe instead of a probably not, and the structure of the video might have differed, but I think my overall opinion would be fairly similar. That's all for Icewind Dale, so before we get onto the channel update, let's cover some criticism from a bunch of different videos, starting with someone who said that the difficulty I faced in Descent 2 was because I was bad at the game. Now, I thought I did alright for my first and only time playing through it, but given how difficult the game can get in the harder modes, I guess I shouldn't be surprised by that comment. Be that as it may, critiquing difficulty in video games is something I've been mulling over recently in preparation for another video, and it's boiled down to a question of how skilled one needs to be in order to properly judge a game. The issue, however, is that the line for that is incredibly blurry, and the question itself might be a little too subjective. On one hand, if you're able to play the game proficiently, that might suggest an underlying understanding of how the mechanics operate, and therefore give your opinion on them more weight in many people's eyes. However, that doesn't mean you can necessarily dismiss a newcomer or noob's criticism out of hand, because simply being unable to properly execute an idea doesn't mean that the idea is completely worthless. For instance, my mother would sometimes give advice when my sister and I were going through swim team. With the mentality shown by the comments here, it would have been easy to dismiss that feedback because my mother didn't have any direct experience, due to nearly drowning as a child, which, as you might expect, didn't bring warm fuzzy feelings whenever her face is underwater. Despite that, she could still observe patterns and understand what a given swimming technique is supposed to look like, and more importantly, understand the reasoning for it. That meant that, as an observer, her feedback could still be valuable. In the case of my Descent 2 review, I rewatched it to see where I talked about difficulty and what I said, and my critique was mostly focused on the difficulty curve and the added complexity rather than the difficulty itself, especially when it failed to adequately explain what was going on. I'll admit that I probably hammered the point a little too much in the grand scheme of things, as the game was meant to be a continuation of the original, so of course it was going to be more difficult and more complex. However, I think some of my reasoning still stands regardless of skill level, and even if I am perceived as garbage at the game, at least I made that clear by being self-aware of that fact. Huh, what is that? Phoenix Cannon?
Oh, the Phoenix! Yeah, by the way, the projectiles bounce off walls, so be careful.
I noticed! Oh man,
Yeah,
I could get
it
such
uses a lot
awesome
of
trick
ammo,
shots
so
if I were
be
actually
careful.
good at this game. Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
That is awesome. I like this gun. What?!
Wow.
That didn't happen. That didn't happen. On a similar note, apparently I struck a nerve with my Total Annihilation review. I was tempted to ignore this comment because I don't like to give angry insults attention, but since it's for a relatively old review and game, I figured I would set the record straight. To start, Total Annihilation was the 4th game that I reviewed, and while I've only covered 33 games in my time on YouTube, the time span between them all should say how much things have and haven't changed for this channel. Granted, old school game reviews are an evergreen topic, which means the time my video is released shouldn't matter, but may as well add that for context even if you don't agree that it matters. Regardless, when it comes to Total Annihilation, it was a game that I really wanted to like. It was the predecessor to an RTS that I also really like. There were a lot of interesting ideas when it came to unit variety in between and within the two factions, and the economic management is something I really wish more RTS would implement. However, StarCraft 2 has effectively spoiled me when it comes to user interface, overall usability, and difficulty curve, which is why I thrashed the game for its terrible unit pathing and inconsistent difficulty curve. Worse yet, I'm normally willing to give the benefit of the doubt when it comes to game design, especially when I'm not necessarily proficient at something, but of the games I reviewed, Total Annihilation is only one of 2 games that left me angry and frustrated at the game itself, because I could clearly identify where the game was screwing up and didn't feel like there was anything I could do to fix it without adding mods. Given how rarely it happens when that threshold is crossed, it's the kiss of death, and my only apology was in not bashing the game harder. Also, work on your grammar, old man. You aren't helping your case by using poor sentence structure or misspelling what should be easy words to spell correctly. Anyway, to throw in a more serious critique, One comment on my Baldur's Gate review was unhappy regarding what I said about the difficulty curve and how inflexible it is. I believe there were other comments that pointed this out as well, but either way, I think the issue was just a matter of focus. When I think back on that time, I didn't have a lot of experience with an open world, or at least a more open-ended gameplay paradigm, where you're allowed to go pretty much wherever you want. I'm very much used to games which are much more directed, and while some of them might rely on procedural generation or have branching pathways, the way forward is the way forward, and I'm used to games that are balanced accordingly. However, with an open world paradigm, you end up running into a very different situation where, irrespective of signposting, you can end up wandering into an area that you or your party is completely unprepared for. I may end up making a short video detailing this, but I end up having trouble getting into open world games because of that, as it often feels like I'm facing an uphill battle as I'm learning the game, and then once I'm past a certain point, it ends up being easier than it should be. Hell, for all the fun I had with Middle-earth's Shadow of Mordor and the most recent Zelda game, those are two prime examples of exactly what I'm talking about, and I know someone who doesn't like the former because he got discouraged by the initial hurdle. So to make a rambly response more concise, I get the complaints, but I'm used to more directed games which I know the difficulty curve is going to be more consistent, and at the time didn't have the experience to recognize that for what it was. In that case, it was a matter of subjective taste that I was speaking too authoritatively about, and I'll be mindful of that if it occurs again. Next up, I've got a few stray comments that have made mention of my inability to research. In one case, I was unaware that BioWare had made other games before releasing Baldur's Gate, and apparently CD Projekt Red has also been around for a lot longer than I thought as well. Also, there was a way to get past my one gameplay nitpick in Chrono Trigger by changing something in a menu, but because I made an assumption about the technical capabilities of the game, I didn't even think to look for it. And in another failure to do proper research, I apparently misunderstood the complaints around Cortana in the Halo series, though this one can be partially deflected given that the direction they went for her appearance was somewhat evident early on, at least depending on your outlook. So yeah, whenever I make a factual error like that, be it in the preamble or review proper, definitely call me out on it. I am terrible at research, and being reminded of that will help me to improve as I keep making videos. And finally, just for fun, let's go through some of the amusing ones, because as I was grabbing screenshots, some of these were too hilarious not to share. First of all, apparently I struck a nerve with someone in my Diablo 2 review, because apparently it's a bad thing to use Diablo 1 footage in a review of Diablo 2. I'll admit it might have been the first review I ever did, and I'll further admit that the review is honestly way too long and went on far too many tangents, especially towards the end. But this was also the first time I was doing any kind of review ever. Did it last too long? Yes, and I'll admit that I don't relish the thought of looking back on it because of how shoddy it is in hindsight. But what really gave me a laugh was the unnecessary barrage of insults. Oh my gosh, I'm such an effing moron for having a 3-minute long intro in a 48-minute video. How dare I not answer for something that I did 4 years ago? Apparently I'm such a brainless Okay, I can't. Wow. For one thing, even if I were gay, I'm not your type, darling. Stop asking. Second, is that really all you can come up with? I mean, I know the point was to insult me, but come on! How hard is it to be creative and come up with something that'll actually hurt instead of just regurgitating your average 4chan thread? Come on, man.
Surely you can do better.
Next up, someone said that my issues with Shining Force 2 are simply inherent issues with my personality. I was thinking of addressing this with the rest of the Shining Force 2 comments, but honestly, I have no idea how to read that. Based on the cons I listed at the end, I'm not sure what kind of psychoanalytic lens he's using to invoke the armchair of psychology, and the comment is old enough to where I'll probably never get an answer. Last and by no means least, let's end with a shitpost, because I've been challenged to make my way through all of Shining Force 3. Also,
It'll be
before you can face me, done you.
those were the days. I need to go rewatch some of those. That's everything that I have to reply to, so let's talk about what's been going on with the channel. I won't make any excuses for the lack of videos, as I've been a lazy bastard as always, but to give you a false sense of security, here's what I'm planning for the short term, starting with what you won't be seeing for a while. In some of my last videos, I had planned on doing the following. A follow-up looking into the fandom regarding the generic children's cartoon I looked at a while back, and a video addressing the points I keep bringing up in my reviews. It doesn't matter if something is generic, so long as it's well executed. For the former, I've been lurking in YouTube videos regarding the subject and getting a sense for that microcosm, since it's the one I'm most familiar with, and my plan now is to try and interact more directly. Between forums like DeviantArt, Reddit, and whatever remains of Tumblr, and hell, maybe 4chan if I dare brave it, I'm sure there's plenty I can find out, especially now that I'm caught up on the show as far as my brother is concerned. As for the latter, that one is getting pushed back, because the script I have that initially addressed it ended up turning into a Star Wars video, comparing and contrasting how The Last Jedi and Knights of the Old Republic handle subversion. A worthwhile topic given that I had plenty to say on it apparently, and one that you might see in the next couple of months, but not one that really answers the initial question in a satisfying manner. So because the script turned into that, I'll need to start from scratch when it comes to that video in particular, which means it's going to take longer than expected. As for what's actually coming, I have finished playing a game for Through the Looking Glass, though I'm going to be trying to do something a little different with the style of the review. I don't want to say too much now, but because of the amount of work for what I have in mind, it might be a while before it gets published. At the time of recording, I have picked out a game to start playing in the meantime, but it will take me time to get through it, so I don't expect to have a review out until sometime in February. As for other content, I do have a couple of other videos that I'm working on, one of which is actually pretty far along. That video specifically is meant to answer the question as to why I keep making snide remarks about game journalists. The audio editing is mostly finished on that video, though while that's usually the bottleneck for me, I'm going to be stepping into an active minefield with that video, and I'm going to be taking my time getting the video portion sorted out. If I'm going to inevitably rustle feathers with that video, there's no sense going in unprepared. Besides that, I've also got a video in the works talking about all of the chicanery that's been happening with Blizzard as of late, since it seems like they can't go 3 weeks without another reason to be very, very concerned about what's going on there. And honestly, it's for that reason that I haven't finished a video for it, as at this point, it'll end up coming at the end of the year after things have really gotten bad, at least if things keep going at the pace they currently are. As for long-term plans, those haven't changed much, though as usual, it'll take longer than I expected. I was hoping to have a proper PC by now so I could do live streaming and more modern releases, but there are a couple of things keeping that from happening. First off, I had a choice between stockpiling for a PC and buying a Switch for the new Smash Bros. Given how much fun everyone has been having with that game, myself included, I do not regret my choice. Unfortunately, the day that Smash Bros released, I found out about some instability with my current job to where I might need to move for the second time in 6 months. So even if I did have the money to spend on a PC right now, that ain't happening until that mess is sorted out. At least my current apartment just got gigabit internet installed, which I'm gonna miss if I do need to move, but hey, at least I can brag to my friends about the live streaming that my PC can't handle yet. Whoop-de-freaking-do. With that said, that covers everything I wanted to talk about, so thanks for listening to this surprisingly long video. I'm looking at the word count right now, and holy crap, this ballooned out of proportion. No wonder why large YouTubers never do this kind of thing. Still, it's something that I think is important to do, especially as I'm experimenting with a smaller channel. So hopefully it'll be at least partially scalable if the channel ever goes anywhere. So for now, I need to get to work on the next video, so until then, I'll see you all later.